My name's Jennifer Fratello, and I'm the Director of Research in the Center on Youth Justice at the Vera Institute of Justice. I know many of you have heard of Vera, but I'll give you a quick 30 seconds about who we are and what we do. We are an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit center for justice policy and practice. We have offices in New York City, here in DC, in New Orleans, and in Los Angeles. And we work with the government on research, demonstration projects, and we provide technical assistance to help leaders in the government and civil society improve the systems people rely on for justice and for safety. In the Center on Youth Justice where I work, we focus on issues that affect young people involved in both the juvenile and the criminal justice system, and we work to promote the well-being and safety of youth by making the systems they're involved in more equitable in policy and in practice. So I've been invited to speak today about a study I'm doing in New York City on the impact of stop, question, and frisk on young people who are in neighborhoods where the highest concentrations of police presence and police practice in the city can be found. I will start by just providing you with some background and context, which will help you understand why we thought this study was so important. And then I'll give you an overview of the study, which we're due to wrap up in the early summer. I kind of snuck in here at an interesting time in our work. So we're finished with our research. We haven't released the findings publicly yet, so I'm going to talk a little bit more on this sort of big picture level. Luckily, Dr. Rosenbaum found a lot of the same types of things that we're finding in regard to legitimacy and fairness and perceptions of the police. So I think the theme of our findings are sort of the same. So I'm sure many of you know this term and you're very familiar with it. It's stop and frisk is defined by state statute. This is how we define it in New York City and state. When a police officer reasonably suspects that a person has committed, is committing, or is about to commit a felony, the officer can stop, question, and possibly frisk that individual. Now this definition is straight from the NYPD website, so this is how it's talked about in terms of their kind of standard policies and practices. Stop and frisk is one of many proactive policing practices used by NYPD officers for a long time now, and it's deliberately concentrated in areas where there's high levels of violent crime. We call them impact zones in New York, and I know many of you are familiar with these terms. So the practice has been touted by the mayor and by the NYPD as one of many that have kept guns off the street, have kept murder numbers low, and have increased public safety. And indeed, crime is down, and New York City is considered to be one of the safest big cities in the entire country. Still, there's a fierce debate going on, and it's largely focused on three issues. First, whether or not it's an effective policy. Second, whether or not it's practiced in a way that is constitutional and equitable among different races. And third, regardless of effectiveness, whether there's collateral consequences both on individuals and on community relations with the police. There's very little known about that. So I'll share a few slides with some contextual data that's used just as a starting point for any conversations about this issue that happen in New York City. So a few facts. First, stop and frisk is widespread and controversial. You'll see here that several 100,000 stops are recorded each year by the NYPD, and it peaked in 2011. That number in 2011 was over 685,000 stops. So that total represents about a 400% increase from the total that was recorded back in 2003. 2003 is an important year because it's when the numbers became available, but it's also the year, sort of the year after current Mayor Bloomberg, as his administration started. In recent years, the stops result in arrests about 6 or 7% of the time. There's summonses an additional 6 or 7% of the time, and contraband is recovered about 2% of the time. Now, these clearance rates get a lot of attention by the public and by the advocacy community as evidence that the policy is not effective. They only clear guns less than, I think, 1% of the time. But I think we as researchers know that you need to study a lot more than that to make any statements about whether or not the policy is effective. You can't just look at a few data points. Another big part of the issue is the location of the stops. As I said earlier, it's very much concentrated in a handful of areas where violent crime is persistent. So this graph shows us the top 8 precincts, location of stops. About 25% of all stops in the past year took place in these 8 precincts. There's 76 NYPD precincts. So it's notable because there's such a small subset of the 76 police precincts that are patrolled by the NYPD. Notable also because these 8 precincts are have a high proportion of Black and Latino residents, every one of them. So the 75th precinct, the largest bar over here, that's a neighborhood known as East New York in Brooklyn. Gets a lot of attention in the press in New York City, and there were 31,000 stops conducted in just that one precinct alone in 2011. So just a brief overview of the goals and the approaches of Vera's research. We wanted to add to both the research and the knowledge base by conducting a study designed to better understand the impact and experience of stop and frisk on young people and families in communities where it happens most frequently. And we wanted to think of some recommendations for ways in which the residents and the police could work better together to increase overall public safety. And we thought this was really important because a lot of the research that's going on right now, nobody's really gone out to talk to the young people who are experiencing this. A lot of the research in the city is really focusing on this large data set that the NYPD puts out. And it's very good research, but I think the youth and the kind of family voice has really largely been ignored. And I want to remind you once again that this isn't a study of the effectiveness of the policy. We sort of don't have the data or the approach to even go there. So we had 4 overall research questions. I'll give you a few quick examples of how we ask questions of people to try to get to them. First, we wanted to know about the frequency of police interactions experienced by young people in highly patrolled neighborhoods. Again, going back to this NYPD data, it's very rich. There's a lot in it, but there's no way to know about frequency. It's at the stop level, and there's no person-level identifiers available. So we asked people the frequency of stops. How many times have you been stopped in the past year? How many times have you been stopped in your lifetime? And what happened? And what was the outcome? Next, we wanted to know how it relates to their sense of safety. We asked a lot about sort of police avoidance, daily routines, use of community space, and feelings of safety in the community and in school. We wanted to know how this relates to their attitudes towards the police, so we asked a lot of questions about perceived efficacy, legitimacy, and reporting. And we wanted to know how it relates to perceptions of self-efficacy and resilience. So we conducted the study by first examining the publicly available NYPD data to help us really define the issue and to define the sites where the highest intensity of stops were occurring. And then we went into those neighborhoods last summer, and we surveyed about 574 young people, and we interviewed about 40 additional young people and families that we recruited in the streets, as well as through community-based organizations. And we also did focus groups with adult representatives from community-based organizations. So we're currently in the kind of at the end of analyzing the data and writing up the findings, and then we'll be briefing the city sort of internally before we really release any findings to the public. We have a report coming out in early summer. I will say that what we're finding is that it's a very nuanced story. The relationship between young people and the police is very complicated. These young people have been subject to a high level of violence and victimization, probably not a surprise. They do rely on the police, and they do feel safer when the police are around. They have a sort of broad definition of public safety, what it means to be safe, that involves kind of relying on family and friends as well as the police. And we look forward to sharing some more. Our report will be out in early June. Thank you.